Well, good afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Dan Churchwell, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Programs and Education at the Acton Institute, the co-sponsor for today's event, and or the week's events. We're absolutely delighted to sponsor these events at Calvin. We've co-sponsored several in the past, and we were right here in Grand Rapids as well. And so it's fun to see some of these partnerships, a lot of the great scholarship that's going on. If you're unfamiliar with the Acton Institute, we're a think tank, ecumenical think tank based here in Grand Rapids, started in 1990, and we deal with the intersection of faith, work, and economics across many spectrums. One of which is the Kuyper translation project, the beautiful volumes you see out there at our table. Acton was the kind of the lead in getting that published over the last 10 years or so. So those 12 volumes are a part of Acton University's work in translation. We have a deep program bench. We do about 50 events a year. Our flagship is Acton University. I know multiple Calvin faculty and constituents have come to that. We have over 900 people from 80 foreign countries talking about the intersection of faith, work, theology, economics. It's a fascinating summer conference. Love to see some of you there. We also have a deep research bench where we publish peer-reviewed journal articles in our Journal of Markets and Morality. Multiple professors here at Calvin have published in that journal over the years, as well as our trade publication, Religion and Liberty, which is a beautiful volume on more popular level things that is published quarterly. So if you want to know more, go to acton.org, again, A-C-T-O-N, acton.org, or talk to me at the conference. I'd be happy to chat a little more about the Institute. It's my pleasure today, though, while you're here, is to hear Dr. Jason Stansbury. He holds the James and Judith Chambry Chair of the Study of Ethics and Business at Calvin University, where he has served as on the business faculty since 2008. Jason is particularly interested in Christian moral imagination in business, as Christians strive to bring the moral resources of our faith to bear in business problem solving. He's also a co-convener of the Business Ethics Interest Group at the Society of Christian Ethics and the conference coordinator for the 2024 Annual Conference of Christian Business Faculty Association. Jason also chairs the Jansma series on faith and business, which convenes triennial symposia at Calvin University School of Business regarding theological concepts in business ethics. He's also published in our journal multiple times, has been to Acton University, and we're just, again, delighted to partner to bring Jason Stansbury to the talk about common grace and moral imagination in business. Please welcome Jason.
Well, good afternoon, y'all. So, thanks for that introduction. A little bit of overview. As soon as I open my mouth, people can tell I'm not from here. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. That's where I grew up. I have been a Reformed Christian since high school, which is to say I have the zeal of a convert because I was not a Christian before that. Know a little bit about economics. My introduction to Michigan was in college. I studied in Ann Arbor and majored in economics. As you're probably starting to gather, I'm not a theologian. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a social scientist by training at a couple of different levels. I also spent some time in business practice. Worked at one of the so-called Big Four accounting and consulting firms, Deloitte. At the time, it was Deloitte and Touche, and at the time, it was one of the Big Five. But that is another story. I will say that some of those stories prompted some of my interest in business ethics. So the turn of the century was an interesting time. And so decided to flee that world back down to Nashville, Tennessee, a little closer to home, where I could eat Chick-fil-A and Waffle House to my heart's content, and immerse myself in the life of the mind. So PhD at Vandy, came up to Calvin in 2008, and love being here because I get to think about and talk about business ethics in terms that really have a lot to do with my reasons for being interested in it. I get to tell students what I wish someone would have told me. So it's a good place to do this work. So that's the brief version. But like I said, so not a theologian, not a philosopher. There's definitely going to be some social scientific kinds of concepts in here. I hope you enjoy them. Off we go. So then, that said, for not being a theologian or philosopher, I love being at Calvin and I love being at the Kuyper conference because we get to talk about some theological ideas that I myself have found generative in my own life. And I don't usually start with this, but because I'm at the Kuyper conference, I can start with common grace, and y'all know what I'm talking about. What a beautiful idea. And so one aspect of common grace, especially that I find beautiful and generative, is the idea that because it has pleased God to allow humans to understand some of what he is doing in his world, through general revelation, but also through the discernment that we get of special revelation that he's given us. Right? This is an opportunity to understand and participate that is a magnificent thing. And then, right, here it is in a little more detail. Speaking of the Kuyper Translation Project, I have wisdom and wonder cited down at the bottom. So God has allowed people in a variety of institutions, in a variety of religious traditions, not necessarily just Christians, to develop insight, ingenuity, and even genius across history. There are things that we can and should be learning from outside of the Christian tradition. And yet, special revelation through Scripture allows Christians to discern, so what does this mean? What is it for? What is God doing? And I think it's important to think of that discernment as itself an expression of common grace, because it has not to do with the salvation of the elect, but instead on the preservation and functioning of the world for the elect and the reprobate. So, grace that is common to all of us. But wait, there's more. So, it seems to me, as a business ethicist, that this common grace, besides giving us an impetus for trying to keep sin from having its full and fearsome effects, besides recognizing that God allows humans to work productively and provide for their own needs, as is written, the rain falls on the just and the unjust, right? There's even more to it than that. There should be a meeting of the minds enabled by this common grace, a kind of a moral imagination in which Christians are bringing some of the discerned insights of our tradition into secular contexts. That is a big part of what I'm trying to do in this paper, is highlight some of the ways in which that moral imagination can happen. Like I said, that's not where I usually start. Here's where I usually start. The vacant witness, the empty sign, the religious incongruence, where Christians who are not intentionally hypocrites, but just find themselves looking back at what they have done, who they have been, and saying, oops. The evil that I do is not what I wish to do. And so we have this problem of, right? And by the way, this is well established in the sociology of religion, and that's another of my little sites down at the bottom, right? People of any religious conviction often do not actually believe all of the things that their commitments espouse, and for that matter, do not always often do not behave in ways that are consistent with even the commitments that they do genuinely believe. And so I will say, this bothered me back in the day, bothers me today. The fact that I think all of us can think of, and if we were confessing as Christians ought, probably regularly are thinking of the ways in which we have been incongruent with our own beliefs. And so I thought, how might we address this problem in business, this problem of we as believers are not living up to our own intents and our own commitments? Now, I also want to point out some very recent work. A sociologist named Andrew Lynn wrote a book on the faith at work movement and found, and I love being able to talk about this at the Kuyper conference, and found that Kuyperianism actually is widely understood and widely recognized as providing a foundation for faith integration in the workplace. There are lots of people in the faith at work movement, business people, opinion leaders, not academics, that self-identify as Kuyperians and believe that Jesus Christ claims every square inch under his lordship. And yet, that belief tends to serve mostly to mediate between the demands of two quote-unquote greedy institutions. The church, which would like more of your time and more of your money and more of your attention to do all of the wonderful things that it does, and your job, which would like more of your time and more of your energy and to pay you less money for all of the wonderful things that it does. And so this idea that your work matters to God has in practice become a kind of a shield that allows people to say, well, because my work matters to God, then it's actually not so important that I spend so much time and energy, money involved in the work of the church. I can, in good faith, spend it at my work because that is my calling. And what it does not often translate into is, and then what transforming influence are you supposed to have in that calling? How are you glorifying God in that calling? It turns out that over and over again in Andrew's document reviews, interviews, participant observations, was not really part of the discourse. Many people simply did not get there. That's a new idea. That book came out last year. Here's an old idea. This book came out in 1988. I apologize for the gendered language from the mid-1980s, but I think the illustration stands. This is a quote from a famous industrial ethnography of a large chemical company and a medium-sized textile manufacturer. And I think this little statement, and I'm not in the habit of reading my own slides because y'all can see it, but I think this little statement encapsulates some of this religious incongruence problem that is familiar to many business people. And so I would suggest that if people who self-identify as Kuyperians then are able to endorse such a view, there is possibly a misunderstanding of sphere sovereignty afoot. So that brings me back to my motivation for this paper. Then how might Christians bring some of the insights from our tradition into the workplace in ways that are genuinely contextually appropriate, right? In ways that do respect the fact that business is not church, that business is not a nonprofit, right? That there are things that business exists to do and logics that businesses need to follow that are in fact different. And yet to say, well, business is what business is, what business is, leave it be, is unsatisfactory. So there is a challenging merging of horizons here that I would like to facilitate. In order to do that, here's where I'm going to shift to a little bit of social science. I think it's helpful to understand some of the underlying social psychology of religious identity and of the ways that religious identity is expressed. So first, the idea of the centrality of an identity. Now, all of us, let me see if I can even, this one have a laser? Oh, cool. I love lasers. So, all of us have multiple different roles, right, that we're part of, right? You might have a church self and a home self and a work self and maybe an ice hockey self, right? We're in Michigan, so where I'm from, it's a baseball self. And, right, these are all aspects of who you are, and you enact these aspects of who you are in different contexts. And actually, speaking of hockey in Michigan, when I was in college, I went to college in Ann Arbor. I was in the marching band, which was a great deal of fun. And then because I figured out I could get into games for free if I was in the respective athletic band. I joined the hockey band. Because like where I'm from, we don't have hockey. So like the idea that people are skating around on a sheet of ice, I just thought that was so cool. So I joined the hockey band. And you may be aware at Michigan, like they have very animated fans, and the fans have chants that are directed at the opposing team, and particularly the opposing team's goalies, and the band helps to lead these chants. And it started to occur to me that maybe these chants were not consistent with my identity as a Christian who is supposed to not have salt water and fresh flow from the same fount. So, right, sometimes these identities overlap, sometimes these identities do not overlap. Right? And so I think the little Venn diagram is a useful way of thinking of, well, there's different aspects of self, and then we struggle to figure out, right, how much should these overlap, and where are these disjunct? And then there's this wonderful multi-intersection here in the middle. I would suggest those aspects of yourself that are present regardless of which role you're in, regardless of where you are, those are central aspects of your identity. For instance, in my undergraduate business ethics class, see, I when I teach, I wander, but my microphone is here, so you'll see me starting to right, and then have to come back because my microphone is here. I apologize, I'm not trying to dodge anything. So in my undergraduate business ethics class, we do an exercise called the Reflected Best Self-Portrait, and the idea there is to facilitate the development of virtue among students. And so I ask my students to collect feedback on their own behavior from other people that know them well. And the assignment is ask 20 people that know you, ideally from different parts of your world, because they all want to ask their parents and grandparents, which is wonderful, right? But I also say, co-workers, housemates, group mates, teammates, floor mates, stand mates, right? People that have seen you in action in different parts of your world, even if they haven't known you for the last 20 years, even if they haven't known you for the last 20 months. If they've known you for the past 21 days and have seen you in action, they might have something to say. It would be good to get feedback from them. And I say, have them tell stories about 3 different times that you have demonstrated any of the 24 character strengths in the VIA classification of character strengths and virtues. There are many catalogs of virtues, right? I'm a retired Boy Scout. I kind of like the Boy Scout law. I really like clean. Clean's a big one for me. But right, I find that the VIA classification is broad enough that it's pretty helpful, and also is conveniently available online for free. And we have our students take a little survey instrument that gives them a sense of what they think their virtues are. So we use the VIA classification and ask students to collect feedback on times that they've demonstrated these from different people. Now then, and they write an essay on it, right? And sometimes they're surprised, right? They didn't realize that some people thought that they were really kind. Or they thought that they were really funny and nobody said that they were funny. This is also a useful surprise. So getting this feedback, right, helps to reshape people's self-concept a little bit. And one thing I love to point out as I'm reading these is when they do what they're supposed to do and they say, okay, I heard from this person at my job and this person in my house and this classmate and this relative about times that I have been kind to them. I cheer, right? I say, it seems that kindness really is a virtue of yours then, if it is a stable disposition that manifests across life roles. Indeed, you have a habit of character, of thinking, feeling, and acting. And because it's kindness, I tend to think that is a good habit, one that's beneficial for the one that has it and for the people around them. So I'm like, now it seems we have a virtue. Whereas if someone is giving me only examples from, right, their siblings, wonderful, I'm happy, but I say, is this just a family thing, or did you hear anything about this from coworkers? And then sometimes they'll identify that themselves. And they'll say, right, the only people that told me that I'm kind were people in my family, some of whom I haven't seen in a few years, but the people that I live with tell me that I'm funny. And I can tell I'm funny because I'm really sarcastic, right? And then I kind of tease apart, these may not be consistent. So, right, this idea of, right, if there are aspects of yourself that are consistent across different roles, then those would seem to be central aspects of the self. Now, see, and there I go, putting down the clicker when I need to move to the next slide. Different way that religious identity may manifest. There's also this idea called salience. Salience has to do with how front of mind something is for you in a given context. Right? And I like this little picture because I suspect that, right, a lot of y'all saw the picture and immediately thought of a different word for good news, gospel, right? Because that's an idea that's familiar in this room. And so I've just what psychologists would call primed all of y'all to think in Christian terms, right? I have brought this idea of the good news to be front of mind. Now, in light of where we are, both at the Kuyper conference and at Calvin, it was probably fairly front of mind anyway. If you're at a hockey game, it might be less salient. Doesn't mean it's not part of who you are, right? It might be fairly central to who you are. Being a good news person, being a person of grace and peace and generosity. But if the environment that you're in is not sending you any cues that that's relevant here, then you might kind of forget. And then it might not really come up. And so, I'm a business professor. I love four squares. And so you can think of these two things as being independent, right? And so your religious identity, right? Even people who claim a religious identity, if it is neither central nor salient to them in a particular context, school, work, family, hockey, it is quite likely not going to be expressed anywhere except in places that it is salient, e.g. church. You might have a religious identity that is salient in a given context, e.g. church, but not central. There's some places where it comes up, there's some places that it doesn't come up. Where it comes up, then, right, you think in those terms, you talk in those terms, you behave according to those expectations, you do not have religious incongruence. But once you leave those contexts, it's gone. Some families, right, make religion salient. They'll pray before meals. They'll have a little devotion after dinner, right? They go to church together, etc., right? So salient at home, but might not be salient outside the home. Similarly, you might be someone for whom your religious identity is central to who you are. It's something that tends to be manifest across contexts, and yet, in a given context, there's nothing that's really reminding you of it. And then it still might not come up. Case in point, one thing that I do in my undergraduate, in all of my business ethics classes, on the front cover of the exam, I have them write a little pledge. I've neither given nor received unauthorized help on this test. I got that from high school. And I think that's actually kind of a handy thing because, right, I really like Calvin students, right? I adore that their heart is in the right place, and in many cases their faith is central, and they are with the program, with a lot of what we are doing here, and yet it pays to remind them, don't cheat in ethics class. Not because they don't know, but because it helps to remind them. And then, of course, there's this magic quadrant where, right, your identity is at once central to you, important across different aspects of yourself, and front of mind in the moment. That, of course, will tend to make your religious behaviors congruent with your religious beliefs. So, different social scientific idea. Schematic articulateness. So schema is a $2 psychological word for ways of looking at the world, right? If you think of the human mind as a very elaborate pattern matching system, which, by the way, is why artificial intelligence is so awesome or creepy, depending on how you look at it. It's also a pattern matching system, at least neural networks that, for instance, ChatGPT uses to imitate human speech, right? It just reads lots of text and starts to recognize the patterns, and this word typically follows that word, in light of the paragraphs that went before. So if humans also are elaborate pattern matching systems, then the schemas are the patterns that are in your library that you use to make sense of the world around you. Some people have really deep libraries of schemata that they can use to make sense of their world. Some people whose faith is very well developed have lots of nuanced ways of looking at the world in religious terms. I happen to think this is a lot of what we do in a Christian educational institution, is helping people to be transformed by the renewing of their minds. And so people that have undergone some of such transformation, right, are able to see the world and think and talk in terms of some of this library of concepts. Some people have not developed this library of concepts, and so they're just not available, and they don't see some of the same things. They don't see that shalom is not just not fighting with someone, it is also appreciating and enjoying them. Right? They don't see that sin doesn't just apply to chocolate, right? But to a whole range of culpable violations of shalom, right? If you don't have the concept, then you can't use it to understand, you can't use it to describe. Then similarly, and I'm not drawing a contrast in a disparaging manner, I'm just saying that some people also have a very rich library of schemas that they can use from business, and if they have those, then they're able to see the world in these terms, right? I tell you what, it is great fun sometimes walking around with some of these people. I had a friend that was literally an efficiency engineer, and so like when I walked around with her, she just saw like queues and inventories and waste everywhere. Last time I was in Nashville, I met up with a couple of alumni down there, one of whom is a structural engineer, right? I mean, she designs concrete structures, and we met up for dinner downtown, and we were walking around in downtown Nashville, which is completely different than the Nashville I lived in. Nashville I lived in is gone. And so she was pointing out like all of the structures of like the parking decks, right? And so we're just stopping on the sidewalk and gazing at this beautiful parking deck, right? And she's explained, do you see how like it's hung out onto the sides and all of the structural support is in the middle? And I'm like, oh, cool, right? And the people on the other sidewalk must have thought, wonder what they've been drinking. But when you have a library of schemas, then you can see things that other people who don't have those schemas can't see. It is useful if you want to do faith integration in business to know a lot about business, to know what you're looking at. So here's where we get to moral imagination. So like the background is over. Now it gets, I think, really interesting. In ethics, I suspect a number of y'all know all about this. By the way, this is my working definition. We love to teach dilemmas. We love to frame up problems that are impossible, where no matter what you do, it is somehow inadequate. Because framing up a dilemma, or a trilemma as the case may be, there's no reason to need to have only two inadequate answers, really causes students to have to wrestle with, well, but how are we really constructing this? It makes them really have to understand what are the different theories that are being used in the conflict between ideas here. And I noticed when I started teaching business students per se, business students, when you give them a dilemma, often will just like invent their way out of it. They don't want to just stick with, no, I didn't give you those additional resources. Stick to the problem as written, right? But that actually is kind of a good business habit, right? If you aren't happy with your options, invent more options. If you're stuck with a problem framing in which no solution is adequate, then maybe the problem is your framing. Invent a better framing. That's moral imagination. So then, how do you do it? And I should have dropped a citation. In fact, I should have dropped the citation on this slide. This is from Patricia Werner-Haynes' 1999 book, Moral Imagination and Management Decision Making, New York, Oxford University Press. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant book, very influential in the field of academic business ethics. She is a pragmatist, so, and by that I mean like American pragmatism as a philosophical school, so be forewarned, but it's really clever. And so that's where I get kind of this tripartite, or maybe I should say three-step model of moral imagination, which she in turn got from Kant. So, first step, form an accurate mental model, i.e. schema, of the situation at hand. And I want to pause and say, doers, business students want to skip this step, right? People want to rush to the solution. And I always have to say, no, wait. The answer you get depends on the question you ask. You must frame up the problem. What are we dealing with? And honestly, right, as a former management consultant, and management consultants are also doers, we absolutely learned, right, the plan phase is the longest phase of the project. You must spend the time to understand why things are the way they are. There are always reasons why things are the way they are. Even if they're bad reasons, they're real. And if you have not comprehended even the bad reasons, then your solution will fail. So, right, when we do cases, then students can get a little frustrated sometimes that we spend so long sketching what are we dealing with. The theories we've been using, how can we use the theories we've been using to understand why the problem is the way it is? But it's indispensable. And then that brings me to my next slide, which is, and how do you get really good at that? By having a really big library of schemas that you can draw from. And so, right, if you want to do faith integration in business, good to know a lot about business, but you need to know a lot about faith as well. And then, of course, right, I've already talked about reasons why it is the way it is, but I also want to emphasize extremely important to be able to characterize. So if this is a problem, if we're talking about a problem framing, then your problem framing must comprehend, so what is unsatisfactory about the problem? I do want to say, loved last night's plenary, because Sarah did a tremendous job of explaining we have two sets of schemas from two different traditions that frankly do different things and must be held in tension because, right, one is thoroughly descriptive in its orientation and presumes the way things are, but then the other tradition is very good at asking, but is that really the way things are, and what ought be the way things should be? And so, right, I really loved, right, the value of these rich, even though incommensurable schemas for forming a representation of the current state that's actually useful. So, phase one, the word that Werner gives it is the reproductive imagination. So think of a reproduction of a painting, for instance, right? Know what you're looking at. Second step. This is where we get a little more imaginative. If you don't like your alternatives, imagine new ones. And that, too, is really helped by a deep library of schemas that can describe that future state in detail. Here's where I'm going to loop back to that social psychology that I was talking about as well. So remember our diagram, and maybe there's a church self and a home self and a hockey baseball self and a work self. Well, this intersection here, right? If, for instance, a central religious identity exists at that intersection and is familiar with schemas on the other side, then it might say, well, hey, what about this thing that we did? Could we bring that over here? And so, right, you can see, for instance, I juxtapose worship with presentations, right? Imagine if in office presentations there were a consistent cadence that always included confession, repentance, forgiveness in the office. I have things to confess. And I bring that up because back in grad school, I worked with someone who was really into quality, like high-performing, high-quality, low failure rate systems, and he was really interested in healthcare. And it turns out one finding in healthcare is a best practice is to always talk about the things gone wrong, right? So every week they call it a mortality and morbidity conference, right? I mean, who wants to sign up for that? But they have to do it. And they talk about, okay, so like what went wrong this week? And it turns out that, right, y'all might be anticipating if people feel like they're going to be blamed for things that went wrong, they do not want to talk about what went wrong. And they don't even want to talk about things that other people did wrong because they understand the reciprocal there. Mortality and morbidity conferences tend to be ineffective except when there is a mindset of what Amy Edmondson called psychological safety. A bunch of people have heard of psychological safety now. It's entered the common parlance. It started out in healthcare. And specifically, when people feel like they can speak up and not need to worry about, am I going to get blamed? Am I going to get sanctioned? Am I going to get fired? Right? But instead, it's, yep, shouldn't have done that. And the conversation is, yep, these things happen. What structural measures are we going to take to keep it from happening in the future? Instead of, what personnel measures are we going to take to keep it from happening in the future? You see how that becomes more generative? Those are way more effective conversations that do demonstrably lead to fewer medical errors. So, right? And I'm not claiming that, right, borrowing an idea from worship resulted in that. But I will say, maybe some of the things that we think about, maybe some of the things we do actually would port over relatively well. Another example that I used talking about this presentation at dinner last week. So early on in my consulting career, I was staffed at General Motors, and their global headquarters down on the riverfront in downtown Detroit. And early in my career, back in the 20th century, new hires made lots of copies. And so I spent a lot of time in the copy room on, I forget what floor of my tower. And the bulletin board and the coffee were both in the copy room. And one thing that was up on the bulletin board, a GM employee in that tower, I don't know what floor he was on, he and his wife had just adopted a little girl from Poland. Like, just adopted. They had just returned. And so, like, she doesn't have any of her identity paperwork yet. But she was sick, so they took her to the doctor, and the doctor was worried, and they sent her to a specialist, and cancer. Little girl. Which, I have no words. Here's the next problem. No identity documents. Not a U.S. citizen yet. Not covered under the family's insurance. So the hospital's like, we can treat this. That'll be $160,000. And they darn passed the hat at General Motors. And it was bake sales. And it was pizza parties, and it was all of the library of fundraising stuff that you do through the PTA and the Boy Scouts and the Deacons, right? $1,000 at a time whittling down this bill. right, at the time, Fortune 2 corporation. And I was like, that is not the stereotype I had of the general. I thought that was actually kind of clever, right? And hey, is it a complete solution? No, but I tell you what, if they were able to make a $20,000 dent in that $160,000 bill, I think that's a difference that makes a difference. So again, right, I think that this ability to borrow ways of looking at the world, practices of dealing with the world from one aspect of one's identity and import it into a different aspect of one's identity, that is a form of productive imagination. That is, of course, greatly facilitated by having an articulate central identity that knows how to reach into both. Now then, third step. So this is called free reflection, and this is where you ask, okay, this imagined future, is it actually better? Is it actually possible? This is not supposed to be a flight of fancy, though, of course, when you're trying to construct a new alternative, then you have to suspend disbelief for a few minutes, or a few hours, as the case may be. And so it is important to then ask, like, would we even want this? And I will just say once again, last night's plenary, what a great example of the necessity of a rich library of schemas for asking, yeah, but could this even work? And I think economics does a great job, as you outlined, of disciplining some of our hoped-for alternatives, right? Some of our policy ideas. What might we change? Well, let's ask, and then what might we expect to happen? Would it be even worse than the status quo? That kind of free reflection is crucially important and, as Sarah outlined, and something that people of good faith sometimes skip. So, now that we've got these three stages, then I'd like to suggest iterate them. By the way, this is the Guggenheim Museum in New York. I don't know if any of y'all have been there. I've been there once. It's awesome. And the way it's laid out, if you haven't been there, you don't know. You might not know this, but if you have, you know that's a spiral. It's a great big spiral from the ground floor all the way up. And so the exhibitions are progressive in the way that they are laid out in a spiral around this central atrium. So there is a natural progression to what you're looking at that goes from the bottom to the top. It's a magnificent way to see one of their exhibitions because they show the way ideas and their expression progress through art. And so I also want to suggest then, right, if you're really doing free reflection well, then you're probably going to come up against a dead end. Iterate it. Beautiful idea, probably not feasible. Return to the drawing board. What do we change? Return to the drawing board. What do we change? Return to the drawing board. What do we change? And after you've done it, howsoever many times it takes, and I know I sound like an academic here, right, deep in the world of thought, but, right, I'll also say the creative types that I know, right? I loved working with a dean who was also an English professor on some Calvin stuff a couple of years ago, and we were drafting up things for their strategic plan. And I'm used to when I write something and then it gets critiqued, right? Then I'll strike out a phrase, I'll strike out a sentence. She just and wrote the whole thing fresh. Every time she took the feedback and words just came to her. It was impressive. And then, right? And then you could read my thing that after I had, right, revised it 5 times, it looked like it had been pasted together out of 5 different sets of ideas, right? And hers was this beautiful conceptual unity, right? And so the iteration, I will say, is a best practice for creating better things. So then, overview, in summary, you can use, and by the way, I have a how coming after this, but overview and summary. You can use moral imagination to overcome religious incongruence instead of, well, you can read it. Use those aspects of your Christian self to not just take the world as it is, as if the power of God is not already at work there, making things better. but instead to ask, what's he doing and how can I cooperate with him? What do I know about who our Lord and Savior or sovereign over all things is? How do I get with his program in the actual context in which I find myself? And iterate it until it works. So then, how? First, priming. Remind yourself who you are. One thing I saw at Deloitte that impressed me, I had a bunch of Catholic coworkers at the firm, and they observed Lent. And so one thing about observing Lent was like, you'd go to lunch, right? And then you'd all sit down and they'd be like, oh yeah, I gave up pop for Lent, right? I gave up sugar for Lent. I gave up French fries for Lent, right? And it's this reminder to them and to everyone around them that they have a self and they have a set of commitments from outside of their job. That's powerful. Whether it's wearing a cross, whether it's keeping a Bible on your desk, right? The ways that you remind yourself, it's not so much about like telegraphing an identity to other people. It's about reminding yourself who you are. But if you remind yourself who you are, then that identity is salient when you need it. Second, sound like Carl Weick, complicate yourself. Have a lot of different ways of looking at the world. Even better if you can have ways that actually don't mesh easily, ideas that are incommensurable. You know the Samuel Clemens / Mark Twain saying, and I think I might be misquoting him, but the mark of a first-rate mind is the ability to hold two contradictory thoughts simultaneously. And hey, right, as someone who loves philosophy, that's painful, but as someone who loves solving problems, those generative tensions are useful. And then finally, so complicate yourself, broadening your network, learning to observe. I've been talking almost as if classrooms and books are where it happens, because like I'm a professor, of course I would think that. But if you have people in your network that come from a variety of backgrounds, then you don't have to know it all yourself. Then you can call. And then, of course, people who learn to observe the world around them. I'm married to a former auditor. She notices everything. And then she points it out to me, which is wonderful. I do see more things thanks to her than I would otherwise. So, right, learn to take it all in, right? And you too will have a bigger schematic library to put to use. And then, finally, I want to make a distinction between organized reflection and rumination, because rumination is what I usually do. And I have to say, it is not productive, right? When I am sitting just stewing over what happened today, that's not how you create better options. So I want to commend, instead of ruminating, journal. Or have someone you trust as a sounding board that isn't going to just agree with you, but is going to ask you probing questions about, well, why do you think it's that way? How do you think it got there? Why do you think they're defending that position? Right? So instead of ruminating, if you can create a space to really, in an organized way, reflect on what you've been seeing, you can turn that also into a useful set of schemas. So then, that brings me to the Q&A. I also want to give Acton another shout out here. This is an issue of the Journal of Markets and Morality where there's a whole bunch on common grace in business, including this paper. So do check out JM&M. It's a fine journal. And with that, I think we have a few minutes. We're supposed to end at 4:30, so a few minutes for questions.
Let me get the mic around. Is there a question we can start with?
Jason, I think that the challenge often for younger people, thank you for this, in terms of how you set it up, is that once they cultivate a sense of an alternative reality, their next thing is, but I'm not in charge. And And so how do we help people who are not in charge but envision an alternate reality?
I'll just speak to that from up here. See, I want to walk over to you. Sorry? Oh. Nah, I'll use this one. I love people who are not in charge. I love people who are in charge too, but I love people who are not in charge because they are not as invested in the existing way of seeing things, right? And so, and Shirley, I know you know as a business professor about confirmation bias and escalating commitment and the whole raft of ways that people, when they get invested in a way of doing things, become really determined to continue seeing it the same way. So I think that there is perhaps some advantage in not being in charge for imagining new alternatives. But then I think, Shirley, what you're really talking about is, right, but there's this huge constraint. And I would say, yes, but it's only one constraint. Just because you do not exercise formal authority in an organization by no means renders you powerless. And then I'll say, I was just talking about this the other week in my undergraduate class. Referent power and expert power, right? French and Raven's bases of power. Some of them are formal, right? Do you have the power to reward? Do you have the power to punish? Do you just have a title that causes people to respect you? That's wonderful, but the power that's really interesting is what will people do for you because they like you? What will people do for you because they know that you know your stuff? And when you say, I'm worried about this, and here's the reasons why, right? And if you know how to lay that out cogently and concisely and winsomely, that's a form of power all its own. And young people, right? And I would rather not even use a chronological age framing because so many of us are not young people and yet are also in a position of being new in an organization, being new in a role, being new in an industry, right? And we are neither young nor experienced. So I will say people who do not have formal authority nonetheless can develop referent power and expert power. But saying from my high school cross country coach, who is himself quoting Juma Ikonga, a famous Tanzanian marathoner, the will to win means nothing without the will to prepare. If you want to have referent power or expert power, you must prepare it ahead of time. You have to do the work, help people out, compliment people, be kind, so that when you need to say, y'all, I think we're going the wrong way, they'll listen to you because they like you, right? Do the one thing I did early in my career. I was a systems analyst, and so I subscribed to Information Week. I subscribed to Word's Auto World, right? If you work in the field, you can get a lot of the trade rags for free. And so just take them, read them, know your stuff. You can develop a lot of expertise pretty quickly that way. So that would be my answer, is I think people who are new to a field maybe have more power than they realize. Yes.
Hey, Jason, Michael. Question from a fellow former cross-country runner and business professor. I really liked your stuff about schemas. And social scientists, you might call that models, or historians, we might call that a lens or a tool. And so I'm interested, what are some of the tools that you use in teaching business ethics or your other disciplines to help people look at the world in a different way? So, for example, for me, it might be the close textual reading of an anthropologist, or the field work of a historic preservationist, or the language of a historian that reads in a foreign language. So what are some of the things in business ethics or in your world that help people break out of their own singular schema when they're not trained in those others?
I always know to expect good thoughts from you, Michael. So I would say it's really interaction with other people. So there are so many texts out there. There are so many resources out there for acquiring new ways of thinking. The problem is not that people lack exposure to texts. The problem is that people lack engagement with the texts that are available to them. And so what prompts engagement? Peers. that are engaging and cause what Mike Pratt, right, one of Carl Weich's disciples out of Michigan, called a sense-breaking experience, where your schema, your way of looking at the world, right, you encounter the world and you find that it doesn't work that well, and you need a new one. And so I think, how do you get people out of sort of this tunnel vision? I'm going to say one thing that's very traditional and one thing that is not as traditional, but perhaps a little commonplace. And so I know that you probably have even better innovations on this than I do. But case studies are useful for that, especially if you have that magic moment where the students stop talking to you and start addressing each other directly and say, no, that's not going to work, right? And then one person defends their position and they're like, sure it will. And the other person's like, here's why it won't. And as long as the classroom norms are such that remains civil, then, right, it is not only the two that are having the conversation, but it's other people that are maybe starting to say, oops, yeah, I didn't think of that. And then they have to return to, well, do I have a better way? Another thing that tends to work well in my experience, and actually I was astonished when I started doing this. It was right before the pandemic, and then with the pandemic I had to do it. But right before the pandemic, I started doing online discussion forums, right, through our learning management system. I had found that here at Calvin, they're so nice, but they don't like to raise their hand and talk in front of each other. And I used to grade them on raising their hand and talking in front of each other, and they really didn't like that. And so I gave them the option, you know what, tell me at the start of the semester, if you would rather just do all of your discussion on the online discussion board, then I will grade you there. But if you'd rather do your discussion in person, raise your hand, right, then I will grade you there. And it turned out that the quality of classroom discussion diminished not one bit, but there was this really vibrant discussion on the discussion board, right? And then everybody was happy. And so then I went a little bit farther. Now, like, there is no grade at all associated with talking in class. And class discussion has not diminished one bit because the ones that want to say something are still going to say something. You just structure your class for it. But then online, right, where they have a chance to formulate their thoughts and write it down in the way they want it to come across, and they can see what everyone else has said, and they have time to think about it, right, and they're comfortable, right? I mean, they write me hundreds of words. I'm like, oh no, but right, but I'm getting it from them. So I think it's some of those peer encounters, right, that perhaps cause them to say, maybe this idea isn't as good as I thought. And then, frankly, also part of the instructor's role, and this is time consuming, but I know some people, when they grade discussion forums, they just kind of give it, right, check, plus, check, minus. I respond, like I write them something, and I send it to them over email. And so that's where I get a chance to say, here's what I liked, what about? Right? And granted, my opinion doesn't matter as much to them as that of their peers, right? Even though I assign the grades, like I am in an important respect irrelevant to them. So, so I think the combination of authoritative input plus peer input, right, does seem to create a bit of motion. Hope that's helpful. Would love to follow up.
Please thank Jason for his talk this afternoon.
Happy to hang out and talk further with anyone who would like to.